Okay, I think we are going to get started here. So thank you everybody for coming out in the heat and through the traffic. Our panel today is going to discuss the U.S. and NATO in a changing world. Thanks again for coming. I'm going to introduce the panel. I'll give you a few notes about the run of show, and then we'll get going. So this is a fantastic group of experts with very different perspectives on the topic in front of us. There may be some panels that you'll be going to this week where people could be accused of groupthink. I do not think that will be the case today. So a few introductions. First, we have Matt Duss, who is the Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. In prior roles, Matt was a visiting scholar at the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment, and before that, he was Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, and before that, he ran the Foundation for Middle East Peace and worked at the Center for American Progress. Next, we have Constanze Stelzenmüller, who is the Director for the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution, where she's also a Senior Fellow and the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations. She's held the Kissinger Chair on Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress, and worked. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, don't worry. And worked as a Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. And last, but definitely not least, is Alex Velas-Green, who joins us from Heritage, the Allison Center for National Security, where he's a Senior Policy Advisor focusing on defense, deterrence, and alliance management in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East, just a few regions. And previously, he served as National Security Advisor to Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri. So thank you all for coming. Before we dive in, just a few notes about how we're going to do this. First, we're going to talk for just under an hour, have a moderated discussion, grouped under a few broad themes: threat perceptions, burden sharing, the summit that some of you may have noticed is happening, and maybe a question about values and what they mean to alliance cohesion. And then maybe we'll have a few other questions. We'll go where the conversation takes us. Okay, so we're going to talk about threat perceptions. And my first question is for Matt. So Matt, what in your view, this is a multi-part question, what in your view are the biggest threats that the United States faces, and why does it need NATO to counter them? And in answering this question, I'm conscious that you've written eloquently on what it means to have a progressive foreign policy. So if you could both answer the question and then maybe give us a sense in your answer of how you're answering that differently as a progressive than you might as somebody who is a so-called primacist, that is someone who sees U.S. interests as being best served through the assertion of leadership and military strength across theaters.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, first off, thank you very much to Crisis Group, to you, Stephen, and to my colleagues here. Great to be with you this morning. Let me answer that by saying, again, what do I see as a progressive foreign policy, and what's the purpose of foreign policy generally? It's to keep the United States safe and prosperous and free, as I see it. As a progressive, I include the element of solidarity there. I think safe, prosperous, and free, but doing so in a way that does not export insecurity or does not export poverty or economic precarity onto other communities. So I think that is kind of the added piece that I think defines what it means to be a progressive in foreign policy. Now, in terms of NATO, just in the basic sense, collective security, I think, is a very important concept for progressives. We want to work together. We want to promote international cooperation. There's obviously, and military alliances are part of that. But I think putting that in its appropriate place, and not using NATO as, and I'm going to steal a line from my friend Josh Schifrinson, as a kind of Swiss Army knife for all of our military problems everywhere around the world, as has been the case since the end of the Soviet Union, or tends to be the case. That's what we are really wary about. It's overuse and the use of NATO as kind of an effort to kind of gin up some kind of international legitimacy for whatever the United States wants to do at any given moment. But looking at the key threats right now, and I don't want to be cliche here, but I do think one of the most serious threats, I could say, climate change. Obviously, we're all experiencing the heat today. It's pretty tough out there. That is real. That's going to get worse. We all know that. That is going to make other challenges worse. But I really think one of our key challenges here is just our the corrosion of our political system. And I'm not saying that as a dodge. I really think that the kind of loss of a shared concept of what the American political project is, and I don't want to idealize or pretend there was ever a perfect era of kind of bipartisanship, but I do think that the state of our politics, the inability to kind of create a durable sense of what America's role in the world is, what we are actually trying to do here, is a very, very serious security challenge for us. Not just the whipsawing back and forth from administration to administration, but the inability of partners and allies and adversaries to believe or trust that what America says it means, and that the agreements that it signs it will stick with. I don't, need to run down the list of agreements we've broken, and this is not just a Trump problem. This goes back several administrations. So I don't want to pretend that this problem began with Trump. As I've said repeatedly, Trump is not a break from the status quo. He is a product of the status quo, and the problem goes much deeper into our politics. So I think I'm just going to land on that, and I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so glad to be here with these colleagues and their differing perspectives, because I do think the conversation we're going to have here, trying to come to, even if we don't completely agree, at least some shared general concept of the kind of what are the actual contours and character of America's role in the world.
Well, thank you very much for that. And actually, it's a great segue to Alex. Alex, I'd asked the same question about the primary threats, but if you could also take on Matt's point about the shared political project and how that interacts with the conversation about NATO, which can be pretty divisive sometimes. Yeah. That would be great.
Well, I'll speak like this in the hopes that it supports the recording. I would say just a couple things off the bat. First, thank you as well, echoing Matt's thanks for having us, and hope this will be a useful event for everybody involved. I would start first, or maybe second, by agreeing with Matt's point. I mean, when I think about the purpose of U.S. foreign policy and defense strategies for national security agenda more broadly, it is first and foremost, above all, to provide for the security, prosperity, and freedom of the American people. That is where it starts, where it ends, and that, if pursued, I think in a thoughtful way, as we've seen in history, it has the ability to provide very significant benefits to peoples around the world. But that does not change, and it should not obscure the fact that the central purpose of American foreign policy, certainly as I see it, is the safeguarding and advancement of American security, freedom, and prosperity. So I think just as a starting point, there's a sense of agreement there. Obviously, we would disagree, I think, probably in some of the ways that manifests. Second thing I would say, too, is also, third, is also a point of agreement. It is, there has been, I think, a corrosion of a sense of comedy and unity in the American political project. That's not news to anybody in this room, certainly if you've been paying attention. And this is, for me, one of the things that strikes me is almost, illustrate by the opposite. So there is one place, I would say, where there is still remarkable bipartisanship in American politics, and it is oftentimes in foreign policy. You see that. You reference groupthink on NATO. It's a great example. You talk to your average mainstream Republican, average mainstream Democrat, they're probably going to say a lot of the same things about the alliance and a lot of other aspects of U.S. foreign policy. But when I think about the corrosion of American politics, a lot of the reason why I think that has occurred in recent years and decades is because much of the policy that you have seen a bipartisan consensus on is bad, right? When you think about U.S. foreign policy relative to the metrics that I laid out a few moments ago, it hasn't gone very well, right? And that's not a statement about Democrats' foreign policy per se. George W. Bush, I think, was not paragon of exemplary foreign policy, right? We've had decades of bad policy in this space. It's left Americans materially worse off by each, I think, of the metrics I defined before. And that, I think, quite naturally has caused frustration on both sides of the aisle, and has driven, among other things, President Trump's victory in 2016, the strong position he's in now, Bernie Sanders, I think, appeal on the left, my old boss, Josh Hawley's appeal on the right to others, J.D. Vance, you go down the list, right? But this is the context I think we're operating in. And it's the context in which I think we have to think about, how to achieve those goals, preserving and advancing and safeguard, U.S. American security, freedom, prosperity in the world we're in today. So I think, with that, just focusing on the specific question, when I think about the greatest threat to American interests today, at least foreign threats, China stands head and shoulders above the rest, right? And this is not entirely novel, right? The logic of why China is a problem is something that George Kennan would recognize. Folks from decades before him would recognize. Europeans in the 19th century would recognize, right? It's a question of balance of power, ensuring that no other country can ever grow so powerful in the international system or the relevant regions within it to potentially overwhelm us in ways that do imperil that security, prosperity, and or freedom on a potentially lasting basis. China is the only country in the world that could potentially do that. Now, the statement about how powerful it is, statement about the region it is in, the Indo-Pacific, is in many ways the center of the global economy. It will become more so if China is able to dominate it. Not only will it be able to prevent the U.S. from accessing many of the markets that are vitally important for our prosperity and security and the rest, it'll also be able to leverage control of those, as any regional hegemon would seek to propel its own rise and displace the United States as the world's most powerful nation. I think that is evidently bad for American security, freedom, and prosperity. So I think that more than anything, ought to be the focus of U.S. strategy in the world. Last point I'd make on this is the U.S. can't do it all. Primacists of both parties, right? Primacists is usually often referred to conservatives, but liberals and nationalists on the left, I think, would fit many aspects of that description. Have really, I think, tried to pursue what you described as a maximalist set of ambitions in the world for many years. Again, that is one of the reasons why I think U.S. foreign policy has produced such bad results for such a long time. We cannot keep doing that. China is not to be, I think, underestimated, nor are the requirements, I think, if we are going to prevent China from achieving hegemony in the Indo-Pacific and then taking advantage of that. So we have to focus the resources available to us, acknowledging that they are scarce, and that is why I would argue that we need to prioritize, and that will, among other things, require us to think differently about alliances, especially NATO. And I can talk about this more in a moment, but specific regards to NATO, if we're going to deny China's imperial ambitions, one of the key things we have to do is to strengthen deterrence in the Pacific. To do that, we have a force. The U.S. military can only fight and win one major war at a time, so we're going to have to draw in forces, U.S. forces allocated now to the European theater. This will create gaps in Europe's defenses unless our allies step up. So it is imperative that they do so and take primary responsibility for Europe's conventional defense. That is how we can safeguard Europe for the foreseeable future on an enduring basis, even as the U.S. shifts focus to the Indo-Pacific.
Okay, so we're going to get to burden sharing in next, Constanza, but maybe, and we'll pick up on some of those points that Alex just made at the end, but maybe we can go back to the broad question of threat perception. And, we've heard from Matt that the greatest threat is internal and relates to polarization. We've heard from Alex that the greatest threat is a combination of bad foreign policy and China. I think the question to you is, what do you think the most important threats facing the United States are, and how does NATO fit into the picture that we're starting to put together here?
All right. First off, thanks very much for having me on this panel. This is a really good idea. And I'm really glad that we have a sort of broad diversity of views here. I think that's super important. We don't do enough of that. I've tried to do that. My colleague knows at Brookings a lot, but you know what? Come and talk to us at Brookings as well. Okay, I think it would be a good idea. And you've been a guest already.
I'm good.
Sorry, Stephen. I'm sorry, Stephen. We're happy to have you.
Nice try, Stephen.
I don't normally schmooze the moderator until afterwards. Okay, where was I? Threats. I'm tempted to say, and I don't mean this to be flip. Everything, everywhere, all at once. Right? It really is all of what you've said, and that is certainly how it feels when you sit in Europe. Maybe, if I may, I'll say the things that you didn't say about me because it helps explain where I come from. I'm older than both of you. I'm a German. I'm a child of war children. I am a constitutional lawyer by training, and I was a reporter. I was defense and security editor of my paper, and I have been in a lot of war zones and stood at the opening of mass graves and covered war crimes tribunals. I've been in Africa, in the Balkans, in Afghanistan. All of that experience shapes who I am and how I think about these things, not just the fact that I live in Washington, D.C., the capital of the superpower now, and that I lived in Berlin before. So I tend to take, I am sort of somewhat weirdly find myself a sort of, I think my consciousness is a crossroad of tensions, right? I'm a human rights universalist, right? I think there are certain fundamental rights and liberties that ought to be universal to all human beings. And I think that one of the great things that America did after 1945, right, was to spearhead and champion a thickening of international legal rules that were really supposed to apply to the entire world, and that America, by and large, honored more often in the observance than in the breach. That's a huge achievement, and one that we Europeans have every reason to be grateful for, right? At the same time, I'm looking at the world right now, and I feel like I'm surrounded by Schmittians, and I mean that in the sense of Carl Schmitt. Some of you will know that I wrote this essay last year called The Return of the Enemy, where I more or less posit that what we're missing in the current picture of sort of the paradigm of strategic competition is that there are some people and some powers who think of us as absolute enemies in the sense that Carl Schmitt originally defined. I think that is particularly true of Putin. I have been told by some of my China expert friends that that is also true of some of the Chinese elite. I'm also told that there are differences of view within the Chinese elites, but that's not my area of expertise, so I'm going to stay well clear of that. But I think that phenomenon, I think, is what is, for somebody like me who grew up and whose entire life was redefined by the fall of the wall and the sense that now there was going to be liberal convergence and sort of political entropy towards the Western democratic model, that is a hard thing to confront. At the same time, I confess that as a reporter covering the genocide in Rwanda, the genocides in the Balkans, the wars, the war in Afghanistan, yeah, of course I saw wheels coming off. Of course I saw the Americans making mistakes. Of course I saw the Europeans making mistakes. I can discourse at length about these things. But I will say this, the thing that I'm slightly concerned about when I hear both of you talking is that I think that how can I not have sympathy for two Americans who say, listen, we need to focus on our own domestic issues, right? I know your country well enough to know that that is true, right? And I think you have every right to want to do that. What I will only say, and we may go into this in some greater depth later, is that I also completely agree, and have agreed for a very long time, that Europeans need to do for their own defense, more for their own defense and deterrence and resilience. It's absolutely unquestioned. But what happens to us cannot and should not be indifferent to you. Not for reasons of values, and not for reasons of realpolitik. Not least because the conflict with China is one that is already taking place on a non-kinetic level, in the regulatory space and in the economic space, where we as a single market and as a European Union are actually a source of leverage to you and a source of allied power. In the military space, we supply boutique capabilities. But in the economic space, we're a pure power. And whether we fall apart or not, and whether the hard right in Europe, nationalist forces, gain the ascendancy in Europe and break it apart, in line with what the Russians are hoping for, the Chinese are hoping for, the Iranians are hoping for, others, should not be indifferent to you. I'll stop there.
There are a lot of threads here that I think we'll pick up as we continue. So why don't I put another question on the table, and then if you guys want to pick up any of that in answering it, that's great. And Constanza, thank you. That was a great intervention. Those were all great interventions, in fact. So let me go to this question of burden sharing. There does seem to be some convergence around the idea that burdens need to be shared a little bit more evenly or robustly by the United States European allies. I think you hear that from everybody. You hear it from NATO officials nowadays. I think we've written, my colleagues who write about NATO have written, and I think Camille Grand just wrote a great paper for the European Council on Foreign Relations, saying that Europe would benefit from being stronger in all the obvious ways, but it would also benefit politically in the United States by being stronger, because there wouldn't be such a sense of, or the accusations of free riding would be diminished by that. And I think everybody agrees that Europe has made some progress in recent years, but that it also has a huge, long way to go in terms of overcoming practical and political hurdles on everything from defense budgets to arming itself. And meanwhile, there's a discussion here about a very different, very new U.S. approach to NATO, should Donald Trump be elected, which would dramatically refocus U.S. conventional assets away from Europe and towards Asia in the ways that Alex was describing before. So, there is a potential wolf at the door, I think. And I guess the question is, let's start with you, Constanza, on this. Why is it so clearly hard for Europe to make the changes that it seems like it's going to have to make, particularly given the rhetoric you hear from political leaders about the existential threat that Russia poses? And, do you think European military planners, economic planners, are prepared to make an accelerated move in the event that there is a change of administration here?
I think arguably they already are, and they already have, right? If you'd told me 3 years ago that today, 20 or 32 NATO member states would be spending 2% on defense, I would have laughed. Simply because there's so many disincentives, right? But the truth is that we have an extraordinarily powerful, continuing incentive in the form of Putin, who every time we think we might sort of let our guards down and people start to talk of negotiations, will bomb a children's cancer hospital in Kyiv, right? There is a very powerful external driver, and it's actually not Trump, it's Putin. Right? But at the same time, of course, these factors are now reinforcing each other. And the days when you could argue in a European debate that this was just about Ukraine and not about Europe are also long over. The Russians are perpetrating hybrid warfare acts across Europe on a daily, weekly basis. And that's becoming quite tangible to ordinary people, right? These aren't sort of conspiracy theories being peddled, by paranoid security agencies. It's tangible, right? When communication lines are being cut, train electrical lines, et cetera, et cetera. That's been going on for a couple of years now, right? People are aware that there is interference, right? And then there is the sort of rather obvious fact that the hard right and the hard left in Europe, use talking points on a daily basis that are eerily reminiscent of what's coming out of the Kremlin or out of Beijing, right? So, again, I was referencing my age earlier for a reason. It's a weird throwback. Back in the days of the actual Cold War, when I was going to law school, I was kind of a wishy-washy liberal, right? I thought that people were being paranoid and overreacting. And I find some irony, not to say humor, in my present situation, where these things are happening and I'm saying, yep, that's all real, sadly. So why is it nonetheless very hard? It's simple, because the defense provision and defense industries are the sort of one of the last hard islands of sovereignty on a continent that has become profoundly integrated economically, legally, politically, right? And because the European defense industry has become balkanized over time, and I will say over recent, the past decades, with some help from our friends in America, right? I remember the days when I was a defense and security correspondent, the Americans were really worried that we were developing too much of our own defense industry, right? And we're actively trying to sabotage it. Well, sabotage may be too hard a word, but they were not pleased when the Germans and the French tried to come up with their own projects, right? Those days are over, thankfully. And we all understand that, and I think it's both in your interest that we organize ourselves differently. And then the remaining obstacle, frankly, is the politics of the policy, right? So I think we're agreed on the threats. We're agreed on the need to do more for our own defense and deterrence, and that requires some sort of integrated approach in Europe, right? But the politics of this are really, really hard, right? Because the political landscape has become so fragmented, because we have accretion of voting at the extremes, and because centrist parties, democratic parties, are really struggling to remain credible and effective and to provide sort of to daily proof that democratic liberal governance works under circumstances of, deep interdependence, daily interference, you name it, right? Plus, citizens in a life sort of driven by social media have the expectation of governments and politicians that every demand will be fulfilled immediately, right? That governments could be like Amazon. You order something and then boom, the next day it's on your doorstep. It's not how governance works. This is arduous. Representative democracy is complicated, arduous, and it takes time, and that is hard to deal with these days. I'm sorry, I'm getting very abstract. Let me end with this. I am absolutely certain that we haven't seen the worst yet. That the darkening of Europe's strategic environment that we are seeing now is likely to get darker rather than lighter, and that therefore the external drivers of the Europeans doing more for their own defense and deterrence will push us toward that. The question is, if there is a Trump administration, how we engage with it, and how we sort of, whether there is a possibility of finding a sort of an amicable, allied approach to this. Last time it was a little hard. If you could reassure me that if you could reassure me, Alex, that if we sort of move up to spending 4% on defense, that all will be well with Donald J. Trump in a second administration, that would be really nice.
So you can gather your thoughts on that 4% figure. Maybe you can bargain for something higher. But I just, in answering that question, a couple of others to think about, Alex. One is, if you could walk us through a little bit more, what this revised concept of NATO looks like specifically, but also given the challenges that Constanza has laid out, the fact that Europeans, for all the desire of some to move in exactly the direction I think that you would like them to move in, but shock therapy, the principle is that shock therapy could work, but it might not, of course. You could make an abrupt change. The U.S. could change its posture dramatically, and Europe could fail to get its act together. And then, it is exposed in a security theater that has all the threats that Constanza has described, and there are U.S. interests at stake there. Are you prepared for, implementing a policy and then having to live with its consequences?
I'm going to try to, there's a lot there, so I'm going to try to move linearly through this. I would say if Germany is spending 4% of its GDP on defense, no less all of our allies, I think many of these problems go away, whether it's President Trump or anybody else, just as a factor of the fact that if they're doing that, then all the challenges I'm about to describe to you become supremely easier to deal with because the money is there. Right? If you're spending 4% of Germany's GDP alone, you're going to be able to field a lot of forces. Right? You're going to be able to sustain them. I was just in Estonia talking to the Balts about some of the challenges currently underway with Germany reposturing east. I mean, this is kind of absurd. One of the world's largest economies struggling with things that would have been, almost an afterthought when you were in law school for Berlin. Right? Like this is, so to a degree I can reassure, I think that would be just as an objective factor, maybe my first attempt, although I'm sure I can do better. And maybe I'll just, the way I'll frame my overall response is, Constanza, you said earlier that we ought not be indifferent to Europe, and I would agree with that. I am not somebody who would say, and honestly, I don't know that many folks, even in my wing of the Republican Party, that Europe doesn't matter. Europe does matter. And so I'm not indifferent to it. And that's one of the reasons why this is so frustrating. If I didn't care about Europe, I would not care nearly as much as I do about the fact that Germany is so far from where it ought to be, or so many allies are so far from where they ought to be in terms of defense spending. And yes, certainly there's been nudges in the right direction, but I just had the Germans in our building, some weeks back, and they were celebrating the fact that Germany has temporarily reached 2% of its GDP on defense spending. Meanwhile, in the year 2022, when I was still in the Senate, we got General Chris Cavoli, SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander, on the record in writing to say 2% was a figure agreed to in a world that no longer exists, for a world that no longer exists, and is therefore no longer an adequate minimum. So I have the Germans in our building celebrating the fact they've reached a target that no longer matters, right? This is kind of absurd. And so this is, I think, again, the source of frustration predicated on the fact that I'm not indifferent to Europe, and I don't think we should be. Zeroing in on this question of what does this alternative arrangement look like, and then what happens if it doesn't stick. There is, in most of the conversations, many of the conversations I have with European officials, I was also just in Berlin having this conversation, some other spots, a lot of it is framed around, Trump. President Trump comes back, bad things ensue, right? That's the frame here. But I would submit that this is the problems I'm talking about today. They are not fundamentally political. They are structural. The problems I'm talking about today derive first and foremost from the fact that the U.S. military can only fight and win one major war at a time. What this means is that so long as China is the priority, we will have to either shift forces out of Europe or withhold forces from Europe altogether in order to deter or defeat aggression by Beijing. What this means is that as of today and for the foreseeable future, so long as this condition persists, the U.S. cannot provide many of the forces that our allies are expecting to be available for Europe to implement regional defense plans that are themselves understood to be vital for deterring Russia. Let me illustrate what this looks like in practical terms. Flag goes up over Taiwan. Folks are concerned, I'm concerned, that there could be a war with Taiwan in the next few years. China would, Beijing has made clear, it would like Taiwan to be part of China. We disagree, among other things. This is a realistic possibility. If that happens, and especially if we have something like a ceasefire or an armistice in Ukraine and Russia's been able to reposture forces into the Leningrad military district, you would expect to see U.S. forces shifting towards the Indo-Pacific in ways that leave evident gaps in NATO's deterrent posture in the East. And if we are drawn into that conflict over Taiwan, you could quite reasonably expect Moscow to look west and see that, well, actually, NATO is not positioned to really do much of anything to prevent us from taking a chunk out of Estonia, for instance. And we can debate whether Moscow would choose to do that. I know smart people on both sides of this. My view is, just as a prudential matter, we should assume they would and try to hedge against it. Certainly, our colleagues in Estonia would tend to agree with that approach, right? So now if U.S. forces go to Taiwan, NATO's dilapidated, can't defend itself effectively because our allies are not there to fill in. Now you have significant risk of what we would describe as opportunistic aggression by Moscow. Second front opens up. What's this? It's a world war. It's their third world war. I would prefer to avoid that. This is, above all, a structural problem. How do you avoid that? Some people say the best way to avoid that is for the U.S. to double defense spending. I would submit that that is unrealistic for political reasons, fiscal reasons, and even if it happened, as we are seeing now, it takes years to convert significant increases, really any increased defense spending, into new combat power. So
we have that too, all of that. The domestic fiscal, takes years to convert.
Yeah, that's certainly true, and yet you've also had 20 years to do this, right? This is not a 2-year problem. We've been talking about this for decades.
Give me a second.
And so, again, sympathy is limited in this regard. But simply to say the U.S. doubling defense spending is not going to solve this problem. We still have this structural constraint, which is why I would argue the best way to get to a place where the U.S. can do what's required under predictable conditions of scarcity, while also ensuring that we and our allies are positioned to defend Europe on an enduring basis, has to be for our allies to take primary responsibility for Europe's conventional defense, meaning that they would field most, if not all, of the conventional forces required to deter Russia under NATO's strategy of denial that it has embraced appropriately, with the U.S. still providing extended nuclear deterrent and conventional forces that are not required in the Indo-Pacific or for homeland defense. This is something that can last, right? This is something that can keep the peace in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, not just for next few years, but for decades to come. This is something that under, again, the predictable sort of structure of the international system can work for a long time. So this is what we've sort of articulated is ought to be the goal of U.S. policy with regards to NATO. I would submit that Europe can do this. There's no disputing the fact that European allies have the economic capacity to do that if they choose to do so. I take the point that this is hard. It's hard for everybody. That's true. And I don't dismiss that. I was having a conversation, again, I've spoken to plenty of officials about this. I get the politics of this. I get the industrial challenges of this. Like, none of this is new. And yet, it remains true that Europe can do it if Europe chooses to make the policy decisions. Incidentally, that is constant feedback I get from European officials, from Brussels to Berlin, London, everywhere. Say, yeah, actually, there are things we can do. They're just really hard. It requires investment. It may require more taxes. It may require curtailing of certain social programs, right? The crux being that these are hard things to do. It can be done, but they're probably not going to do it unless it is evidently in their interest to do so. And this gets to a conversation about values, which I think we'll have a little bit later. But from our standpoint, if they're not, we cannot expect allies to do these hard, costly things unless they see it as in their interest to do so. Wrapping this up and getting to the final point, the task then for the U.S. becomes to show them that it is, right? That's why Heritage is on the record, and others have offered, complementary proposals to make that extremely clear. Our proposal is to do this as quickly and collaboratively as possible, starting by making very clear in a classified setting as appropriate the limits of the U.S. military's ability to intervene effectively in Europe while doing what's required in China. The whole point of this is to make very clear this is not a myth. In very specific terms, here's the problem that NATO faces, right? And then, having identified the forces that our allies have to be able to provide on their own as quickly as possible, identify what we can do to support that, including, for example, on the defense industrial piece, right? That's important. You're completely right. And then finally, to set clear timelines to make these transfers occur, because absent timelines, I think there's every reason to expect the allies will simply just not do it, right? Again, this is all about making it as clear as possible that for structural reasons, it is imperative, it is in our allies' interests to do this.
Alex, if you don't mind, because I know I want to give Matt, and we have a couple of questions to go to, so we can maybe pause it there.
Perfect.
Constanza, you had a two-finger intervention. Matt, I'd love to hear your views about sort of shock therapy.
Man, there was a lot there. I want to take a moment just to respond to what Constanza said at the beginning, because I think I agree with, I am a universalist as well. I consider myself an internationalist as well. And to talk about my own background just very briefly, on my dad's side, I'm from a family of refugees, of Ukrainian refugees, actually. So I take what happens there does matter to me, to our security, but also to me personally. That's always a conception of kind of an understanding of America's role in the world that I've had since I was very young. I think we may disagree on some of the tools and institutions and how much change we can make and where we're doing more harm than good. But as a general concept, I would completely agree that the United States and its partners did a very, very important thing in building a set of institutions after World War II. On my mom's side, however, my mom's from Western Pennsylvania. She comes from a family of independent truckers and independent farmers who've seen their industries devastated over the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And that's why I get back to what I was saying before about the deterioration of our politics. I take it very seriously, understand what Putin's doing, what Xi is doing, what other, adversarial regimes are doing in terms of, messaging, social media, and other worse things. But I do, Putin did not invent American inequality. I know that's not a claim that anyone made. But I think even if we're going to acknowledge what they're fiddling around in our politics, we also have to recognize that they are simply exploiting and exacerbating problems that we've created ourselves. So I just wanted to kind of say that as a grant. Now, if we're going to really build kind of a durable approach that lasts between administrations. I think we need to take that really seriously. I mean, I think Alex, mentioned Trump in 2016 and also Bernie, and I think what they both represented, even though I don't want to, they obviously had a lot of differences, but I do think they were, articulating a critique that obviously has a lot of traction. A lot of Americans believed and still believe that a lot of what takes place in Washington, a lot of what we kind of take for granted, the transatlantic relationship, our engagement in Europe, how much we spend helping to defend, how much of that is our business. I think we've just not done a great enough job in explaining why that's important. So that's not necessarily a policy prescription, but I do think we need to take that really seriously because Americans have very legitimate questions. They've seen their communities deindustrialized, devastated. And then they see a lot of, people in suits drinking coffee and eating tiny sandwiches in these conferences. And they're like, well, what are we what are we, what is that doing for me? And I think that, again, that is something that our enemies exploit, but those are very, very legitimate questions. Now, turning to the specifics, I mean, and again, I've really enjoyed listening to both of my colleagues on this, but I would just say from a progressive perspective, I tend not to, I'm not as alarmist about China, or I'm not, I think China represents a threat, it represents a challenge, but it is not going anywhere. Clearly, in my view, we need to seek every opportunity to cooperate or collaborate with China on shared threats, whether it's climate, whether it's pandemics. But no, let's be real about China and Xi's in particular vision for the world. It's not similar to mine. Kind of values I think that China would like to impose, and the role Xi sees for China in the future is not one I agree with, and we should take that seriously as well. But also, I think we can take steps that make that threat worse or less. And going back to NATO, just for example, I think the way that we've been kind of pressing this choice on our European allies to align with us against China, do this quicker, I can very easily see how China would respond to that by getting more deeply engaged on Russia's behalf. And I think I heard from an administration official a few weeks ago that China's support for Russia has helped Russia reconstitute its military about 3 times faster than it would otherwise, which is pretty staggering. And again, I'm not going to say that's a product of our choices, but I do think the way that we kind of treat the China issue and pose that as a threat, and this problem that I see, whether it's Russia or China, great power competition, the idea that we're going to sort of revive our political consensus around the new threat, I think that is a real problem. I mean, I've referred to the danger of seeing, Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a kind of manic pixie dream war. If people know the manic pixie dream girl trope, no? Okay, no. I won't go into it then. But just the idea that we are going to...
It's a popular culture reference.
People are furiously Googling it in the...
No. It's really funny and spot on, so look it up. But just the idea that we're going to kind of reconstitute our political consensus around one of these new external threats, I think it's very politically attractive. We already see it hard, it's being used right now in this city around, the speed with which Washington has kind of aligned against China as the new big threat, and the effort to kind of say, well, at least we agree on China. I have concerns about that because we've seen, in the past we agreed on what is the new threat that we all need to unite around, and that didn't go so well. So I'm in favor of consensus. I'm in favor of bipartisanship or transpartisanship, but let's be careful when everyone is kind of just pointing in the same direction. One last point on, my feelings about, I agree that we want our European partners to spend more, to do more, to build up their own military capability. But partially, and again, this is strange for me to say as a progressive, I want Europeans to spend more on their own defense, to buy more weapons, to build more weapons, so that they're less reliant on us. Not so that we can focus more on China, although I agree, we do need to focus on China. We would disagree on how and the what. But so much of what Washington wants from NATO in Europe has to do with our own military-industrial complex. And getting back to the problem I was saying at the beginning, that is part of the corrosion of our political system. I can be the cliched lefty here, but I'm going to do it because
You use military-industrial complex.
Yes, absolutely.
Not if you're embracing it, Constanze.
Yeah. No, but going back to what I said, the corrosion of our political system, the corruption of our political system, the military-industrial complex is a huge part of that. So again, I don't want to keep coming back to focusing on our internal problems, but I have to do that here because that's part of the challenge that I see and why I actually support and think it's so necessary for Europe to spend more. But that again is a problem that we need to focus on here, a much bigger one. Again, not at the expense of America's global role. I think there is an absolutely important and necessary role for the U.S. to play globally. I think we might disagree on the extent of it.
Yeah, it really is a very fair point that it's disorienting if you're coming from a progressive orientation to talk about rearmament and the kinds of things that we are now talking about As a conflict prevention organization, Crisis Group really struggles with that, you can imagine. So actually, this discussion about threat perceptions in the Indo-Pacific is a good way to sort of get into the next topic, which is what to expect from the summit that's happening right now. And I'm going to go to Alex with the first question, which is, what do you expect the summit communique to say about NATO's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and what do you want it to say? What would be a good outcome in terms of the way that NATO postures itself towards that theater, in your view?
Sure. So the trend in recent years has been for NATO to sort of formally assert and at least say that it wishes to take on more of a role in the Indo-Pacific. Some officials are candid that NATO allies have relatively little to contribute militarily there, which is true. Others have more expansive ambitions. I suspect that this communique will stick to that trend and continue to assert that the theaters are linked, that NATO has a role to play in the Indo-Pacific. And my view is I'm very, very skeptical of all of this. It will not surprise anybody, just thus far, that my view is that NATO's first and most important responsibility is to defend Europe. It's not doing that terribly well at the moment, given the challenges I just described. It seems to me that NATO should get that right first before taking on additional missions, especially given the fact that our allies just practically, with very rare exceptions, don't have much to offer militarily in the Indo-Pacific. The only caveat I would offer to this, two things. One place where, actually, how do I frame it? In terms of what I'd like to see in the communique, depending on how it's structured, it may be a good thing for NATO allies to increase defense industrial cooperation with certain Asian economies. The details will matter here, and the basic premise being that I would want to ensure that that does not come at the expense of those Asian countries' ability to strengthen their own defenses as quickly as possible, or frankly, for the U.S. to take advantage of those relationships to strengthen our position in the Indo-Pacific as quickly as possible. So that is something that I'll be looking for, just sort of see what it says in the communique and learn more about the specifics. And then other than that, I'd like to see, really, I ideally, again, like to see that trend reversed, or at least halted, but I'm not sure that we will.
Thanks, Alex. Constanza, what would you like to see come out of this summit? What do you think is the best outcome for the alliance?
Well, there's a difference between what I would like to see and what I think I'm going to see, right? I would like to see stronger language for Ukraine's progress towards NATO membership than the bridging language, which I think is weak and reversible. And I worry that we will do with Ukraine what we did in the EU with Turkey, right? Which is do a sort of fake accession process, which then, falters, crumbles away, ultimately undermines not just the security of the country that wants to join, but also, frankly, the security of NATO, right? Because it undermines our credibility. So there's a very, very fine line to walk here. And given the Russia's attacks on yesterday morning across Ukraine, some of the worst since the beginning of the war, I think that was messaging to NATO, right? As in, we're going to go on doing this, right? You have no way of stopping us. And that brings me to my second point. I would like us to be more forthright with giving Ukraine the weapons that it needs to repel that kind of attack, right? And producing them, or helping Ukrainians produce them themselves, right? I would look. The problem is that I have, in my journalist days, covered a lot of NATO summits, right? And I've participated in some of them as a think tanker. And I will say that I've experienced both the turgidly ritualistic ones, right, where you had the feeling that all of it was so much kabuki dancing, right, over sort of abstract formulas that had no meaning to anybody. But I had the great luck of being at the actual celebrations, in other words, with the delegations at the 2002 NATO summit in Prague, which was the big enlargement summit, where all the Eastern Europeans joined at once. And that is something I will never forget. The joy, the relief, the sheer sort of happiness of these people most of these officials the shadow of Soviet domination, right? And to see what it meant to them, right? To join the free world and the alliance of the free world on that day was, for me, an unforgettable experience. And so, to me, the commitment that I feel as a Western European and as a German, right, is that this NATO summit has to make it clear that no matter what happens in our politics, right, we will maintain that commitment to freedom and democracy and liberal order, right? Now, I do actually want to mention a couple things that I think we've been missing out on, if I may. I
Please.
think the NATO summit itself, is going to be sort of a, at this point with the temperatures outside, I'm really glad when it's over, if I'm honest. Nothing bad has happened, right? Nobody's dropped dead, right? Nobody has tried to lob a missile on the eastern seaboard or stuff like that. Okay, I'm joking, joke, right? But look, what I find really quite striking here is that we can agree with each other quite civilly, right, on what we think is sort of our policy requirements, especially for Europe, right? You have deep concerns, legitimate concerns about your domestic, the domestic situation of America, about a threat from China. You think we should do more. All of that we can agree on. Where I think we are not going to agree on, and I think it is important to lay that out here, is on the question of the importance of the nature of our constitutional orders, and on the importance of geoeconomics in our security policy, right? You noticed, I'm sure, that I'm not saying China isn't a threat. What I am saying is that it is at the same time a military threat, an economic threat, and that the policy that you outline strikes me as overly narrowly focused on the military aspect and not enough focused on the economics of this. And I do wonder, and that's a question I have for you, if, forgive me, I of course, like everybody else, read Project 2025's chapters on economic policy and noticed that there are 2 chapters on trade, which kind of outline 2 different economic worlds, right? To Europeans, globalization isn't, we don't speak of globalism. We don't think that's a false consciousness in our lived experience. It's an economic reality, not just for our own interdependence with each other in Europe, but our interdependence with you, the Americans, with the Chinese, and with others, right? We live in this international geoeconomic space. And much as we're trying to bring back supply chains, as we're trying to increase economic resilience, the notion, as Robert O'Brien outlined in his recent piece in Foreign Affairs, of fully decoupling from China is for us simply economically and politically unrealistic. It's not going to work. And it seems like sort of, honestly, it sounds rather like, the Peter Navarro part of the Project Heritage chapter than the other part, right? Which is not quite in alignment with what I think international economic reality actually is. That's my first point. The second point is even more important. And that is, of course, that, how do I put this tactfully? Can I even put it tactfully?
I'm from New York. It's okay.
I can't wait.
Well, we've all seen Kevin Roberts' quote, right, about the Second American Revolution, which will be bloodless if the left lets us, right? And all the sort of, the invitations to Hungary, the admiration of Hungary on the American right. And I spent part of yesterday afternoon at the National Conservatives Conference, listening to people like Stephen Miller and John Yoo and John Eastman. And my question to you is, or my point to you is, if we can agree with the American right, I think, on many things, but if Heritage's position is, that we all need to be more like Hungary, that we need to get rid of political pluralism, that we need to get rid of the disestablishment of church and state, right? Then I think we are at a potential alliance breaking point. That won't be talked about at the summit, but I think it is one of the key issues next to the geoeconomic one.
So, in fact, my last question was going to be about alliance cohesion and values. But so, Alex, actually, why don't we do this? There's an economic issue there and a values point there, and if you want to take those on, that'd be great. And then Matt, you can have the last word, and then I already see some people gesturing that they'd like to raise questions.
To call that an alliance cohesion point is a bit of a euphemism, Steve.
Well, that's my specialty. Go ahead. Go ahead, Alex.
Okay. Last time I tried to answer 3 questions at once, I went a little long. So
You did great.
I'm going to try and not this time, but please interject as appropriate. I will say, I think, for the record, as far as I know, it is not Heritage's position to get rid of political pluralism, or for that matter, erase the separation of church and state. And as for the others, I'll let them speak for themselves. On the military economic piece, I think you're right. Right? I think when we think from a U.S. perspective, think about our relationship with China. There's military components, an economic component. There are other components too. What I would say from a competitive perspective is my view is that the military piece of this is basically fundamental at this stage when we think again about the Indo-Pacific, our interest in it, and how best to protect them. Even if we're competing vigorously and effectively from an economic perspective, if we don't have the ability to prevent China from using military force to either conquer certain territories in the Indo-Pacific, like Taiwan, or basically coerce others into submission, then we still are not in a position to prevent China from achieving its hegemonic ambitions. Conversely, if we do get the military piece right, then we can compete from an economic perspective, frankly, with a lot more flexibility in terms of things like export controls and other measures that would, again, ideally preference American industry, support working Americans, like Matt was, alluding to in terms of family. Not to say you agree necessarily with policies, but that is why, from our perspective, certainly from my perspective, the military piece is so strong, is so important. My view as well, thinking about Europe, is I take your point too, right? Europe as a market, obviously there's a certain degree of heterogeneity in it, but this is something that we ought to seek to do together as much as possible. My view is that the kind of military reconfiguration that I've described in terms of NATO is fully compatible with dealing with some of these things on the economic side. In part, that's based on conversations with officials. In part, that's simply because of the fact that it's in many Europeans' interests to do so. Right? Nobody benefits. Europe does not benefit from China dominating the Indo-Pacific. Just as we all have shared concerns about many of China's trade practices and other things. So I think that this is an area that where we can and should keep cooperating, and I think we can do all of that, and frankly need to do all of that, even as we get the military piece right across theaters. Values, alliance cohesion. Look, I think shared values are important. I don't think they're as important as interests, when we think about alliance cohesion and effectiveness. And again, I think about Germany, I think about Poland, right? Germany and the United States, no one has ever said that we don't share deeply held views, democratic values, and all the rest that goes with it. And Germany has, again, at least in my perspective, not been a terribly strong ally, right? Think about defense spending, investments, and all the rest for many, many, many years now. Right? Even today, we're having these conversations. So it's an example where there's a strong alignment in terms of values, but it hasn't produced necessarily the kind of policy outcomes you'd like to see from an ally. Conversely, with respect to Poland, I've heard concerns over the years about Poland's, shift towards authoritarianism and similar things. Setting aside my views about whether that's fair or not, right? It is also true that Poland is doing quite a bit to strengthen its defenses. In many ways, is a model ally in that regard. So this is a case again where you would argue that the values are perhaps more divergent, and yet we are achieving the policy outcome we're seeking here. And this brings me to sort of my core point, which again, interests seem to be the most decisive piece here. To the degree it is an ally's interest as they perceive it, then they are more likely to take the steps that we would like them to see in terms of militarizing and strengthening their defenses. To the degree that they don't see that, even where there's an alignment of values, we are much less likely to see those desired results.
Is it in America's interest for Hungary to be as overtly a friend of Putin and Xi as it is a NATO ally?
I'm not in love with Orban's trips to Moscow or Beijing lately. I don't pretend to know the full extent why he's doing it, or what the repercussions are likely to be. But certainly, we can have these differences among allies. And just because Hungary does something doesn't make it, in my view, the right thing to do or something we should all applaud. Just as I don't think it makes sense that to sort of reflexively object to anything that Hungary is necessarily doing. I take their behavior at face value and always subject to the same sort of critical treatment that I would subject any allies.
So, Matt, we have on the table enlargement, the economic dimension of the alliance, and values. You can choose any or all of those to respond to.
A little bit from each. I mean, first on the values piece, I think the question about Hungary and Orban is appropriate. I would also, let's remember that when Turkey was brought in, it was not a democracy. It was very much a question of interest. So I think values. I mean, but let's also put, going back to what I said at the beginning, understand NATO in its appropriate scope. I mean, we're here. The conference is going on. It's on everyone's minds, but it is a military alliance. It's not the tool through which we define our politics or define the nature of our internal politics. It's going to reflect the problems and the good and bad things that happen inside its member states. There were two other points I wanted to make. One, with regard to Ukraine, I mean, coming out of this, I mean, listen, although I don't define myself as a restrainer, I define myself as kind of restraint curious. But I've had this ongoing kind of conversation with my colleagues in the restraint community because I think Biden's approach to Ukraine has been kind of restrained. He has, defined what we will and won't do. I think he's clearly defined an interest in the outcome clearly, but also by what he's chosen not to provide and chosen not to do, he's also said that that is not unlimited. We do have an interest in the outcome of Russia's war in Ukraine, but I really question whether that interest, extends to including Ukraine in NATO. Does it extend to sending young American women and men to defend Ukrainian soil? The president clearly believes it doesn't, and I don't know if that's going to change. And I think we've run into some problems by you referenced Turkey and EU. I think it's a very apt comparison. We've had a lot of problems coming out of Bucharest with Georgia and Ukraine. I think there is a way to I can see a path to securing Ukraine in the future in a way that's short of NATO membership. So I don't know if I'd want to see a communique that is misleading about that, because I think that's where the president clearly is, and other allies. The last point I wanted to make about geoeconomics, and I think that is really important too. And again, putting NATO to the side as what it's supposed to be, it's a military alliance. I do think that key question of kind of the global trade regime, I think that's one of the most important things that this administration has done. Again, coming out of the lessons learned of 2016, the critique that Trump and Sanders both posed about how this system is not working for so many Americans, and I do give them credit for taking taking that problem on. I think we were both at the speech that Jake Sullivan gave at Brookings just over a year ago, where the National Security Advisor gave a speech about global trade. Why? Because they've understood how deeply important that is to our security. But I think if as we're talking about the threats of today, Russia and China, let's also understand how some of those misconceptions about global trade impacted the challenge we face now. Again, not all our fault, but there was a neoliberal shock therapy imposed on Russia that we can draw a very clear line to how we ended up with Putin. There were other things. It's not as simple as that. And of course, 20 years ago, everyone was absolutely convinced that bringing China into the WTO, that exporting, exporting our manufacturing or offshoring our manufacturing into China was going to help, the Chinese economy grow, and that they would obviously liberalize. We've now gotten the memo that none of that really works. But I think the danger is, kind of just recreating a global trade system where we're just using economics as a weapon against each other. Because again, I totally agree. I mean, globalization is a fact. It is reality. Trying to disentangle and decouple, I think, is a fantasy. It's a dangerous fantasy. I think ultimately we are going to be more secure by creating a more equitable global trade system. I think that is a very, very key element of our future security.
So I just want to say thank you to this great panel. You guys covered the full spectrum of views and pretty much the full spectrum of issues. So we really appreciate it. We appreciate the collegiality and the candor, and just a great job. So please, a round of applause. And thank you all for coming and for the great questions. We appreciate it.